Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us first thing in the morning after, I'm sure, some late nights, so much appreciated. We are going to be talking about decarbonization and the new energy management opportunity today. Trickle, trickle, trickle. Excellent. I kind of want to start off with a little story, and then what I'm going to do is pass it over to my excellent panelists and let them introduce themselves. But I think one of the things I hear sometimes with clients, maybe I should introduce myself first. So I'm a principal engineer with SES Consulting. We do consulting engineering. We focus on controls specifically, but we have since, about 10 years ago, realizing that the mechanical consultants don't really understand the controls pieces and are installing these systems that aren't really working. So we got into the mechanical design as well. So now we do both. So I'm coming at this from consulting, and then I'll let all my panelists talk as well. But I want to start with just like a little bit of a story, because I always feel like that's a nice way to set the stage. So one of the things I'm finding a bit with the decarbonization space is that people are like, well, energy efficiency is done, controls are done, now we're on decarbonization, and there's like these two separate entities. And so for context, I had a client install this big, very expensive heat recovery chiller in a care home. So very sensitive area, people need heat, we cannot vacate them, it's a big deal. And they did this without really any consultation. They kind of decided they wanted a heat recovery chiller to offset some of the energy. They installed it, it didn't work. And what ended up happening is they had a very old control system. They had not enough space on their controllers. They didn't have the sensors in place. Really, they had a system that couldn't control a complex piece of equipment like a heat recovery chiller. Now, there were lots of other things that happened on this project, but I think the key piece here is that they jumped into this like decarbonization, like these fancy, shiny, new, big pieces of equipment that, people are keen, like building owners want to be like, yes, I have this heat recovery chiller, I have this huge air source heat pump, and they kind of overlook the controls. So by contrast, we have another client that we're working with to develop a net zero plan. So they want to achieve net zero. And what they did, and this is like the correct way to do it, they had someone come in and look at it and let them know how to achieve it. And so we said, okay, this is how we're going to achieve it. We did it a staged process over 4 years. And the first thing is like, okay, so you've got pneumatics in the building. So the first thing we need to do is like, we're not controlling low carbon equipment with pneumatics. That's not happening. So we're getting rid of those. And then we're upgrading all the controls. And so this client, it's like a success story. It's going really well. We're in this phase 3 now, year 3, and they've done it really well. And so by doing the controls first, not only are they not getting themselves into a situation where they can't control their equipment or optimize their equipment, but also now we have this data in place because of the controls and the trends and the sensors that we can now use to size the equipment to be more efficient and save money and not oversize the systems. So I think that's one of the pieces that I want to touch on a little bit today, is just that like decarbonization is a serious opportunity for controls, because right now it's being missed. And what's happening is that none of these very expensive systems are performing. So with that in mind, we've got lots of great questions, and I'm going to hand it over to the panelists. Maybe before I ask you your questions, I'll just let you introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about, your perspective on this. So let's go to Abby first. We're just going to go in order.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name's Abby Massey. I'm Vice President of our Energy Incentives Services at TaxTaker. We are a specialty tax consulting firm. So all of those federal energy incentives that are available through your federal tax returns, that's what we help clients pursue. We work with contractors, manufacturers, designers, and of course, end building users. I've been doing this for about 10 years, but prior to that, I was a traditional design engineer. I'm a PE. So really, we're the bridge of information. Through these very technical tax incentives, we partner with your CPAs and financial teams to help them understand what's going on, how to pursue these, and then hopefully get these strategies for decarbonization up and running.
Thanks, Abby. We're going to touch on this a little bit in a minute, but Abby's going to talk to you all about like the incentives available and what we think is what it's going to look like as the political landscape changes, which I think is a big deal because, a lot of people are doing these projects because there's incentives. So it's good to know what's out there. So I'm going to go to Lauren next.
Thanks, Stephanie. So hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Scott. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Sustainability for Acuity Brands Intelligent Spaces Group. You might be more familiar. I know a couple people came up to me and saying, I know Acuity from a lighting perspective, and that's actually the biggest segment of our company. We're the largest lighting and lighting controls manufacturer in North America. But I actually sit on the second segment, which is the intelligent spaces side, and it's our fastest growing side. You might be more familiar with some of the brands that are out on the show floor, which is Distech Controls, which is where I kind of grew up over the past decade or so, as well as Atrius, which does cloud applications and data platform. And then we recently brought another organization into the fold through acquisition called QSC, which focuses on audiovisual. And I have a bit of an unusual title, half marketing, half sustainability. This was largely due to the fact that as a company, we have our office here in North America, but we also have our operations in Europe. And the regulatory landscape for us as a manufacturer was making us really have to move forward in terms of our sustainability initiatives and really playing into the decarbonization space. So we had to centralize our efforts, and that was where I was able to kind of bridge that gap. So I work with our facilities management teams to figure out how we can reduce our carbon emissions of our own operations. So I can bring both of those lenses to today's conversation.
Go ahead, Bill.
Hi, I'm Bill Schwabel. I lead the controls group, the controls products group at Johnson Controls. And our focus is really on three things from an outcome perspective. It's sustainability, it's healthy buildings, and it's enabling smart buildings. I joined the company about 4 years ago, really to help drive the digital transformation. And the digital transformation is really helping to enable a lot of the capabilities that we have to drive for that sustainable, healthy, and smart building. So from a Johnson Controls perspective, we're focused on commercial buildings. So we provide solutions and products for commercial buildings, and we focus on that space. That's all the company really focuses on. And it starts with our HVAC equipment. So HVAC equipment uses 40 to 50% of a building's energy, and we've introduced a whole line of sustainable heat pumps and other equipment to drive that central plant, to drive that sustainability from the beginning. But because the control systems are pretty critical to realizing what you want out of those systems. So the big focus of what we're doing, and we'll talk about later today, is about how all of that knits together in the life cycle of the building.
Thanks, Bill. Go ahead, Scott.
Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Cochran with Cochran Supply. I'm the president of the company. Been in the industry for 25 plus years now, selling energy management systems. Cochran Supply, we're a distributor of building automation systems and software throughout North America. We work with contractors, primarily mechanical and, of course, systems integrators. And we see hundreds, if not thousands, of projects every year and what goes in and why it goes in. And I'm here to kind of give you the perspective from the contractor's point of view and how they perceive energy management today and what's actually going on in the field, and try to bring some light to the current state of affairs, if you may. So that's my part. Thanks for having me, Stephanie.
You're welcome, Scott. All right. Thanks, everyone. Great introduction. So we're going to have a couple questions for them. If you have questions at any time, you can raise your hand. We're hoping to have lots of your questions. But before we talk about that, I just want to have a little caveat here, because sometimes I feel like people get hung up on the word decarbonization. And actually, we're writing a big electrification guide, and we were specifically requested to not use that word and to pick a different word. So sometimes the wording is important, and I think one of the things to remember is that energy efficiency is decarbonization. It's the same thing, right? So, in places where the energy grid is not very carbon intensive, what you're going to end up doing is mostly energy efficiency, right? You're probably not going to install electric heat pumps. So just before we get into that, I just want to clarify that when I say decarbonization, I mean any level. I mean energy efficiency, like the 15%. I mean, heat pumps, heat recovery chillers, all the way down to net zero. It can be any range. And I think that's the piece that some people miss, is that they read this and they're like, well, I don't want a net zero building. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about anything that reduces carbon by any amount. Okay. Are there any questions in the audience? Otherwise, I have a couple for our panelists. Okay, we're going to talk to Abby first just because you're right there. Sure. And this was a question we got asked about yesterday, and I didn't know the answer because Abby knows the answer. So we know that, okay, what are the key tax incentives or federal programs that are currently available to businesses adopting electrification or decarbonization, and what changes might we expect given the new administration?
Sure. As you can imagine, this is a hot topic right now, is what's going to happen to these federal incentives. So there's two programs in particular that come to mind when I'm thinking about buildings and strategies for decarbonization, electrification, energy efficiency. So the first is called Section 179D. It's the energy efficient commercial buildings deduction. And essentially what it is if you install HVAC, lighting, or building envelope systems, that includes controls, you can achieve a rate per square foot for that building. So if you get extensive energy efficiency from that project, then you could get up to $5 per square foot on that facility. It's honestly a very underutilized program right now. A lot of people don't realize that the work that they're already implementing will trigger them the availability to claim this deduction. There have been a lot of really positive changes from the Inflation Reduction Act passed a few years ago in this program. It made it more available to a wider group of building owners. It actually resets now. It used to be kind of a one-time deal. If you do extensive work or continual work, you can actually claim it more than once. And so it's a really great program. Another one that I have on the top of my mind is the investment tax credits. So if you're going to install things like solar, if you're going to do thermal storage, even geothermal heat pumps, you can trigger something called the investment tax credit. You get a certain percentage of the cost you spend in that system back as a tax credit. This, again, is a program that's been around for a while, but was made more expansive in the Inflation Reduction Act. So this particular tax credit is actually available to government and tax-exempt building owners, even though they don't pay taxes. They get to use a program called direct pay or elective pay, and they get a check in the mail for the amount of the credit. So this one has been particularly very, very popular in the last few years because of the amount of folks who can now take advantage. But those are the two, I think, that, in my opinion, for this conversation are the most relevant. Now, with the administration change, right, everybody's wondering, okay, what's going to happen to these? Because definitely the Inflation Reduction Act was a Biden policy, and it has a lot of attention right now from Trump's administration. But I've actually been through, I've been doing this for almost 10 years now. So we've been through some administration changes before. We were doing tax incentives while Trump was in office before. And I like to always point out a couple of things. So the first is that these are law. So these incentives have been around before Biden came in and passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and it takes an act of Congress to change law. So the executive orders that are happening, yes, they are addressing some things in the Inflation Reduction Act, but to actually change those policies, it must go through the same legislative changes as House of Representatives, Senate, and then President approval to make those changes. The other piece to note is that many of these incentives were around before. So even if we had a full repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act, we'll just go back to the old rules of these incentives. So 179D in particular, it was actually made permanent under Trump's last administration and extended. So we would just go back to the rules from prior to the Inflation Reduction Act. So yes, we still don't know what's going to happen to them for sure, but I do expect that they will still be around in some form or fashion. They won't just disappear. The other last point I like to make is that if they do decide to do maybe a drastic legislative change like repealing the full IRA, it's almost never retroactive, right? It would be crazy if it was, because then we would never be able to trust these policies when they come through if they were to make retroactive changes after we've already started projects. So I can't guarantee anything, right? Anything's possible. But from my experience, if they do make big changes, they usually give us a window of time to say, okay, if you've already started a project from now through, let's say, July, then you will still be able to pursue the incentives as they were originally put into place through the Inflation Reduction Act. Projects that start after that date will now begin in a phase-out period or will be ineligible. So I don't want everyone to panic. I get a lot of panicked clients, but in truth, there will be warning. We will see it coming. We'll see the legislation get introduced into the House. And so I do see still a lot of opportunity in these incentives in the next upcoming years.
Thank you, Abby. I feel like that was a big question on everyone's mind. And I know from my clients specifically, like without the incentives, they probably wouldn't implement half the things they do. So it's really important to know.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, of course.
All right. No audience questions. Oh, yes, please.
Sorry, are all of the energy incentives able to be monetized by the owner, or are there any that can only be monetized by like your designer or your contractor?
Yeah, great question. So there's most of the incentives are at least originally intended for the building owner or the end user, right? If you're a private tax-paying building owner, you're probably going to be able to claim them yourselves. But in the case of 179D, which again is the energy efficient commercial buildings deduction, if you do work, let's say you're a controls contractor or a designer and you do work at a K through 12 school, they can't claim a tax deduction unlike the other program I mentioned. So that would go to waste otherwise. And so what the IRS did is write in a passage that says they can give their deduction over to the designers of their energy efficient systems. So in that case, in that particular program, if you're a designer of controls, which there's actually case law that supports that controls contractors are a great fit for this, you can claim that deduction on behalf of the K through 12 school. So your choice, you could of course choose to maybe write down your overall fees or provide additional services as a thank you for receiving that deduction, or you can just receive it outright. There's nothing in the tax code that says that you can't. But it's a great business strategy for many controls companies that we work with to reduce the bottom line overall of the business.
And the owner has to sign that over?
Yes, owner signs it over because we have to have a couple of checks in place, right? We don't want somebody coming in and say they did the work because they saw it on a bidding website, but they actually weren't the designer. So there is some checks in place to make sure that we are allocating that deduction over to the right parties. Yeah.
Go ahead, Scott. You can just chime in. You don't have to put your hand up.
Abby, could you speak to, in dollars, some of the potential, savings that can be achieved through some of these programs, like some of the square foot numbers?
Yeah, of course. Actually, not too far from here was a private hospital builder. They built 2 new hospitals in Florida. They received over $3 million in tax deductions for those 2 hospitals. They had a very energy efficient minded design, right? The hospitals did quite well. And when we did the energy modeling process, but yeah, I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars in tax deductions. The other program, the investment tax credits, I'm working with a school district in Nevada that did a geothermal heat pump system, and they're going to get about $1.8 million in tax credits, and that's going to come through the direct pay. So they're just going to get a check in the mail for $1.8 million, which more than offset the cost to increase from your normal heat pumps to your geothermal system. So we're talking about some really big dollars for folks that are honestly planning for this. I think that's the most important piece I like to say. You should be talking to a consultant during the planning aspects of the project so that you can identify the right programs, make sure you're implementing the right technology, and maximizing the benefit back.
That's great. And as a controls contractor, if you can bring that information to them, like I'm a consultant, but I'll often go to the clients and be like, hey, look, there's incentive available. Like, you don't have to pay us, the incentive will pay us, so let's do this project together. So if you can bring those incentives and you have that knowledge, I mean, obviously, free money, clients are keen to do that. So thanks, Abby, that's great. All right, we're going to take a little bit of a tangent now on to Lauren. So Lauren, you have clients both in Europe and North America, which I think is kind of cool because obviously North America and Europe are in very different places as far as decarbonization comes. So what kind of requests are you seeing from clients around decarbonization, and what is the difference that you're seeing between Europe and North America? Is it starting to bridge the gap? Is it very different? What does it look like?
Well, certainly a few years ago, I would say it was starkly different in the sense that our European customers were requiring so much from us as a supplier from a decarbonization standpoint. So already, even a few years ago, they were asking us about our own emissions, because if you think about the full value chain, if you're thinking about emissions, then they certainly care what their suppliers are contributing in terms of those emissions. So even a number of years ago, our European customers were asking us those questions. They are also leaning into third-party rating systems where we as suppliers actually have to enter all of our information from a sustainability angle. We get a third-party rating, and then these large European customers are choosing whether or not to keep suppliers based on their score. And year over year, they're actually cutting off all of their suppliers that are not meeting certain standards when it comes to decarbonization. We are seeing it coming to North America. I would say we're seeing the first movements coming in with those large enterprise customers. So think very big tech companies, that they tend to be the ones that kind of want to get ahead of the regulations. So they're putting pressure on their suppliers, us as manufacturers, in terms of supplying those information. So we were starting to see that a few years ago where there was incentive or a strong encouragement of participating in things like the climate pledge, where you are reporting your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and you're having those vetted by a third party. I'd say one of the biggest things that we're really seeing right now, though, even if we go back to the European customers, is we used to receive maybe 1, 2 requests a quarter from customers where we had to supply all of our information. It's now maybe 3, 4 a week. To the point where our sustainability teams, that we're working as hard as we can and filling out these RFI forms, but sometimes it's hundreds of questions where we need to provide data points as to our sustainability initiatives. So if there are other manufacturers in the room and you're selling in Europe, you might already be feeling some of this pain. But it is encouraging that we're moving towards this. And then I would say one other piece to keep in mind too is, for the longest time we've just been talking about emissions and how we're kind of contributing to it, but I would say we're kind of taking off the blinders of just the building operations emissions and carbon usage, and really thinking about the product that's going in it. So again, if there are other manufacturers in the room, you might have been hearing about things called environmental product declarations, or EPDs. This is almost kind of the ingredients list for your product, and it's talking about the environmental considerations of individual products. So this is starting to become more and more in demand. If you get those third-party validated, it can be up to $10,000 a product. And so this is certainly a consideration as more European customers are requiring this. As companies, we're going to have to start prioritizing, okay, well, which of our products are we going to invest $10,000 per product to get these environmental product declarations? So I'd say it's starting to come more and more to North America. Again, those larger enterprise customers, probably because they're operating on those international scales, are starting to ask more questions about this. So the sustainability teams, but then also the product management, R&D teams, we're having to think about our products differently. I would say even one other regulation that we're seeing coming to North America is around plastics. And if you are, again, a manufacturer and you're manufacturing products with plastics, there are starting to be considerations around recycled content within that plastic. So there's all of these different moving parts that I think is really fascinating for us as manufacturers. I think a lot of us are maybe not fully aware of all of these different changes. It's changing depending on the region as well. So I think we're probably going to come closer to standards over the next few years, but I would say that it is so rapidly changing right now that if you do have sustainability folks in your team, I would definitely encourage that they already start talking to your R&D and product management teams.
How many of you in the room are manufacturers of a product? Oh, not the majority. All right. There you go. All right, Bill. So how have Johnson Controls offerings evolved to address the increasing demand in decarbonization solutions?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about some of the introductory space, especially in our HVAC equipment. About 40% of our HVAC equipment revenue comes from products that we've developed in the last 3 or 4 years. So all of those products are being developed with energy efficiency in mind, and they're being applied in a lot of applications throughout the building types. We certainly see it in data centers, which are giant thermal users and energy users, but we see it all the way down into the mid-market buildings. And a lot of the growth that we're seeing is mid-market buildings that want to manage and control their energy consumption, especially in Europe. So that's where a lot of the expansion, these are buildings that did not have building control systems in the past, and now have a building control system to manage energy management and to manage the efficiency of the equipment. So from a Johnson Controls perspective, as a manufacturer and as a solutions provider, we've seen a massive shift in our focus area from new construction, greenfield construction, into owner-based retrofit, owner-based upgrades, focused on energy efficiency, focused on the healthy buildings, focused on occupant experiences, that's driving a majority of the activity now. So we've seen a flip from 70% new construction, 30% owner-based retrofit, and it's flipped the opposite. So now 70% is owner-based work, and I'm sure you're seeing that in your markets as well. And that the goals of those owner-based retrofits are around energy efficiency, around occupant experience, around getting more digitization and more control over those environments. And we're seeing, initially, even when I joined the business right after the pandemic, a goal of 10 to 15% energy efficiency. Now those targets are 30% energy efficiency with some of the new capabilities, the digital capabilities in the control systems, et cetera. And then often we're seeing 50 to 70% efficiency by updating to electrification in the central plant. So you can really start to drive a lot of energy efficiency, and that's become a cornerstone of our product offer, and one of the reasons why we're focused on these commercial buildings, all the way from what we call the mid-market building up to the large complex buildings. And that desire for the owners to go through a multi-phase, multi-year effort to upgrade their systems. So in a construction event, you're going through the construction event with the goal of getting your certificate of occupancy. When you're doing retrofits and energy upgrades, et cetera, then you can take that in a phased approach based on your budget, based on incentives, based on availability of product. So there's obviously limitations of product and talent and labor to upgrade these systems, et cetera. So all of these are focus areas of what we're doing from a product and solutions perspective.
So to me, that sounds like it's a business opportunity, like it's increased the business or just maybe adjusted it. Yes, Brad?
I have a question. So, like those big retrofit projects, Bill, how much of that is being done through like an ESCO model versus like individual retrofits? Is it?
Vast majority is individual retrofits. Yeah, ESCO comes into it, definitely, but we're seeing more and more of the activity just being, it has an ROI, it has a payback, and pursuing that. Or the payback is in providing the better occupant experience in the building. So if you want to rent your building or have occupants use your building, there's a cost to not having the latest experiences in the building.
I have a follow-up question.
Go ahead.
So you talked about the increasing savings targets moving from 15 to 30%. Are you playing a role in validating those savings? Like, are the owners? How do you make sure the owners are actually achieving? Because it's one thing to say, better controls are going to get energy efficiency.
Right.
But it's quite another to make sure that actually happens. Like, how do you guys?
Yeah. So the energy so the question is around how do we track and validate the fact that the owner achieved the efficiencies. And now with a better sensification, better data, certainly energy metering, et cetera, you're able to track the energy uses in a fairly precise way.
I would echo that, and I'm putting my marketing hat on. I think most companies have leaned into really old studies about the energy efficiency possible through controls and lighting controls and building controls. And now we're really we're starting to see those really be pressure tested. And I think the fact that more and more of us are connecting our controllers, are connecting our sensors, our sub-metering capabilities, and pulling all of this data in together, Brad, hopefully it will allow us to get more accurate details, because whether you're marketing or you're in product and engineering, we've been historically leaning into the same statistics, and they're really outdated. So it's encouraging that now we're connecting more and more of the built space. We're centralizing this data. We're connecting the edge with the cloud. We should be able to start centralizing this information and actually having real time, we call it handprint, where you can actually see how much energy you're saving within the space. So I'm encouraged that we're getting there, but we're still pretty early days, I would say, for the most part as an industry.
Yeah, I think that's a cool comment, because oftentimes we're seeing decarbonization as like a driver. Well, it's not the main goal, but it drives other things. So it's like, okay, my building needs cooling. well, I might as well add a heat pump instead of just a chiller. So they're kind of decarbonizing by mistake almost, just like as a byproduct. And so we're seeing it create this opportunity, and it's pretty neat to see. And then with the controls as well. I'm going to ask one more question before I dive into that more, because I do want to hear from Scott. I want to understand, what requirements are you seeing change? Where's your question? There we go. In terms of like the needs of building owners, are we seeing a shift in like the requests you're getting, in the requirements they have? What are they needing, and how has that changed from the last 5 years, say?
Well, I would say the common paybacks we used to use to sell projects or even devices to end users, those paybacks have shortened. I mean, when I came in the industry, I think we were working off of like a 3-year payback was acceptable. Brad, would you accept a 3-year payback?
Yeah.
You would? Well, a lot of people are getting a little hairy about that. So we're seeing sort of a accelerated, like they have accelerated goals. But frankly, at the same time, unfortunately, what we're seeing is most of them are not baselining their current energy usage. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of a funny conversation with most of them because, they have these goals and you explain to them how they can achieve them and how quickly, and then you ask them what's your current usage, and they're like, they show you their bill. And you're like, well, that's interesting, but, we got to get more into the granular details. So I think that there's still and just on that fact and going on what both of you just said, what's happened though, the opportunity though for the contractor is the fact that integration now, because the integrators, the BAS contractors that can integrate systems together, multiple systems, multiple manufacturers, well, they can come in and they can tie a building together to do command and control and things like that at the lowest cost in history per square foot, right? Essentially, you could come into a building and take the head off and put a new head on, and you could probably get it without bidding on it because it's just not that expensive. And within that initiative, you can simply, make it a goal to baseline the energy usage as part of the new platform you're putting on top of it. What's also interesting about baselining is the internet. The internet's a fascinating tool for people today, especially end users, again, because if you have your energy bills, there's plenty of, Lauren has one, many companies have them. They have services where you can go and subscribe to your utility providers, and they'll provide you a real-time interface to your usage. So, they're like, oh, I got to put a meter in every building. I'm like, no, you do not. I can do it today for you, right? And I think, so we got to look at, like, the ask for the decarb stuff is the cost to do it is lower than ever because of the technology and the capabilities of the contractors today, so.
I do want to speak to the baseline point too. Sorry. And I reference Europe not to say that it's better. It's just more sometimes it's interesting to hear what kind of regulations are there, and it might be coming this way. We are seeing, it's called the Décret tertiaire in France, and it's essentially saying that in commercial real estate spaces, you now have to, by regulation, get your baseline of your energy consumption in any of your commercial office spaces. And so us, again, as a manufacturer, we are required within our own building to have a baseline, and we have to reduce it year over the next X amount of time. So it's interesting to see that there are starting to be regulations coming in where that baseline is actually mandatory.
Baseline benchmark, same thing.
Yes, excuse me, yeah.
All right, thanks, team. That's really cool. Oh, question. Yes, please.
Two questions. One is, how often are you seeing the utility company who offers rebates, they have a team that will basically develop your calculations because they need to report that to the state. So how often are you using that? I know it's never as good as you want it, but it's something. And then the other question is, when you are looking at baseline, you look at energy savings, the meter is a great place to start, but I think my question is, how much do you see building growth cutting into your energy savings? And by building growth, you could have a department that remodels their space, and they add stuff to it, and when they add stuff to it, they're increasing their energy.
Or adding air conditioning to a K through 12 school.
Yeah, it's typically, just to answer the second question, you're really not looking at the total cost, you're looking at the square foot cost. And you kind of want to roll up all your utilities into a common denominator like BTUs or something, and then from there you got a per square foot cost. And then as you do additions, as you make changes, you ask yourself, what is that doing to our per square foot energy cost, right? And that kind of helps you normalize those decisions. Of course, you're going to use more energy when you build a bigger building. And as Stephanie knows, and we talked about this yesterday, efficiency is not about saving energy. Efficiency is about using the right amount of energy for the right application, okay? We have to use energy, folks. It's imperative. So, but are you using the right amount to do what you're doing?
And if I go back to that regulation, what is interesting is it only impacts our office space. And since we're a manufacturer, we don't have to do that benchmark, and we don't have to necessarily do those improvements on production. So if ever something similar comes here, it is interesting to keep in mind that they are kind of separating out the idea of we need to continue to expand and to continue to produce, but the office space is where they're putting a little bit more emphasis to get that reduction.
Did that answer your question? I feel like we didn't really touch on the first one.
I can add a little bit of color to the first part of your question, at least from the incentive space, because one thing about the federal incentives is many of them can stack together, but they can play very nicely with the utility rebates that are available in different places. And so we do work very closely with those utility teams who are already chasing down maybe a specific rebate, or they're building a custom program for a building owner. And the data that they're pulling supports maybe one of the federal incentives like 179D, which there is a path that you can qualify by measuring the energy use intensity score of the building before and after the project. So we work with those folks a lot. Yes, it's not a perfect piece of data that they're giving us, but oftentimes it's what we need, and it's being supported by the utility directly. So we can very easily speak with the IRS and how we got that number, and that it's coming from a trusted resource. So yeah, I think in the case of the incentives, we do work with those utility companies quite a bit.
Yeah.
How often do you see people come back after the completion of a project and they didn't apply for incentives, pre-construction, and then say, hey, can I get credit for this on the back end? If they didn't know at that time, when they come back, does that happen often?
Yeah, so the question, just in case you didn't hear in the back, is how often do we get people coming to us after the project to say, hey, we didn't know about these incentives, and now we want to know if we can apply for them, and it happens all the time. It's honestly surprising. 179D has been around for 20 years. So this is a program that has been a part of the tax code for a very long time, and I still meet so many building owners or contractors or designers who are just now learning about it because of the expanded language from the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of them we can absolutely come back and claim. 179D is one of them. We can actually go back to projects since the inception of the program, which was 2006, and still potentially claim benefit if they didn't grab it before. But some of the programs you have to plan for. There's a sister program called 45L. It's for energy efficient homes. So think multifamily projects. It requires Energy Star certification, and you really need to plan for that in the design. There is a point of no return for Energy Star certification. So unfortunately, sometimes we're educating these people a little bit too late, and they've missed out on quite a bit of opportunity that they could have easily claimed before. So a big part of what I share in having these conversations with folks such as yourself is tell your customers about this. Even if you know just one little iota, hey, I think there's incentives for this project, just say it, because there's a really good chance they don't know it. And their CPAs for the 179D program, you have to have a professional engineer certify the deduction. It has to happen to go on a return. They can't do that work. And so just like you're not going to offer services that you can't offer. So sometimes you're the first person to tell them about these incentives, and that's what gets the ball rolling and hopefully gets money in their hand for the project they were already going to do in the first place.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Go ahead.
I actually want to answer this question before I ask one.
Yeah, there is a mic right behind you if you wish.
Oh, cool. People reach out to ask about incentives for work they've already done quite frequently. Sometimes it is possible for them to still get an incentive, and sometimes it is not. It depends on the incentive mechanism and how long ago they did the work. But if you have a project in Maryland, it would be nice if you reached out to me sooner rather than later. My question is, how do we get to more business owners to let them know about opportunities before they've already done their project or done their project with non-qualifying equipment?
Sure. I think the big thing is educating your team. So we're working with more and more sales teams to help them at least know the basics of these programs and be able to introduce it as a part of their proposals, right? A lot of people are very comfortable with, I think, the utility rebates to say, hey, did you know that this utility has this rebate for this type of project and you can expect this dollar amount back, and they can add that to their ROI calculations. Well, the federal incentives are the same. You should be able to do that exact same strategy. And so we're educating sales teams, we're equipping them with the knowledge to at least be able to say, hey, you're also going to trigger these federal incentives, and here's a rough idea of what you can expect to receive. And then hopefully those sales team have some sort of resource, like a consultant like us or some other specialist in-house, who can then expand upon those programs and educate those building owners early in the project, as opposed to after it's been implemented and closed out. And now we don't have an opportunity to change the scope of that job to maximize those benefits.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a funding model for the federal tax incentives? I'm thinking, like, could there be an executive order that says, yes, that's a law, but we're just not going to fund it?
Well, tax incentives aren't a funding mechanism. It's just a tax mechanism, right? So just like any other credit or deduction you take personally, it's just available as long as it is a part of law. There isn't a pool of funding that they have to pull from for those. Now, the direct pay model where the governments and the tax-exempt organizations can claim it, that's a little bit different. But for a taxpayer who's just not going to pay as much tax, that's a free-for-all. So as long as it's a part of law, you're okay. Where we do get into a little bit of an issue is with grants. So if you're looking at some sort of federal grant, maybe from the U.S., or from the DOE, or there's some rural grants that are available for energy efficient buildings for small businesses and rural businesses. Those do have funding pools. And so there was an executive order that went out, maybe a week or so ago, where they essentially said they were going to freeze funding from the IRA. Those are the programs that could potentially be impacted, is those grants, because they do have to have a pool of funds. So if it's tax related deductions or credits, you're okay as long as it's a part of law.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Healthcare facilities, how does decarbonization work with healthcare facilities? That's where I am.
I can start. So, healthcare facilities, any building with a lab, an operating room, uses a lot of energy. About 40% of the energy of a facility comes from its critical environments. And a big part of the critical environments, if you think of an operating room in a hospital, typically that 40% energy user, that operating room is remaining pressurized 24/7, even when the room is not used. So much like a low energy retrofit of a normal building, a retrofit of a hospital can have a major payback by addressing those big energy users like the pressurization rooms, by upgrading the control system and the valve, airflow valve systems and the pressurization systems in those critical environments. So if you're addressing 40% of the energy usage in a handful of areas in a hospital, that's a good place to start with your low energy retrofit. And we see a lot of that activity. Much like I said, 70% of our activity is owner-based. They're existing hospitals, existing labs, existing universities, all have a mission around efficiency and better occupant experiences, and they're focused on getting pretty quick ROI. We talked about that 3-year ROI. We can see some ROIs in less than a year in some of these retrofits.
I would say there's still an interesting opportunity with healthcare facilities, and one that we're seeing is right now their sustainability teams working in hand with their facility teams are still leaning into very basic reporting, and they are starting to be these larger organizations where they will have to start having more formal reporting for scope 1, 2, and 3. And when I speak to their sustainability teams, they're still, most of them, doing all of these calculations in Excel spreadsheets. So there still is an opportunity for us to come in as experts and to share what kind of technology is available. Certainly it's one that we offer, but there are other providers out there as well to help them as they move these files forward, because they are going to start needing to report on this, certainly if they have any sort of operations touching or near California or other states. These are starting to be regulations that will start hitting them. There's still, again, some of these big players are in Excel trying to calculate these emissions. So you can go there and offer your expertise and talk about the new technology that is available.
Yeah, before we jump into the next question, I'll just add that because we do a lot of work on hospitals. And I think, the way that you would address a hospital is, I'm not going to set back things. I'm not going to set back temperatures, because as much as I'm like, okay, is this space not occupied? They're like, well, I think, but maybe. So we're very conservative, right? We're not going to set back things that need to potentially run 24/7. But like Bill said, there are places like operating rooms where if you put an occupancy sensor in there, maybe they're used a quarter of the time, and for 24-hour period, that's a lot of savings. We don't need to pressurize them. We don't need to keep it, what is the air changes per hour, 10? It's a huge savings in there. And then the other thing we would look at for hospitals, maybe more than some other buildings where we could do things a little bit more aggressively in terms of setbacks, we would look at things like heat recovery and things like that aren't going to affect the operation or negatively impact occupants, but can account for and take advantage of the fact that, there's probably always a heating and a cooling load in this building. So there's different types of opportunities that come available that can, not sacrifice comfort, safety, all of those things. Yeah, go ahead.
So the tax incentives can be transferred to maybe a contractor. Have you seen contractors reduce their bids by accepting these tax incentives?
Yeah, I definitely have. I see both, right? I see some contractors who keep things the same, and then I see some who reduce bids, and even in some cases negotiate up front to offer something additional, even if it's not a monetary exchange, because of course you need to be cautious, right? We're talking about government projects, so you need to be cognizant of your fair bidding rules and regulations. But folks still find creative ways to get some sort of benefit back to the building owner as a thank you for giving them that 179D deduction in particular.
Is there cents on the dollar that you typically see, 50 cents on the dollar?
Honestly, I see it all over the board, because in some cases, even the building owners have their own policies for what they want in a share back as a thank you for allocating the 179D deduction. There is no current law or regulation on how to do that, so it's all over the board at this point.
I love that. That's such a smart idea. We lost a bid recently from a consultant that brought their own federal funding to the table as part of this bid. And great idea. I'm interested that there's so many questions on the incentives, because last time we had Abby on the panel, it wasn't nearly as hot of a topic because there was no potential that things might change. So thanks, Abby, for being here. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for Abby. As a designer on the 179D, can I take a deduction for this year and go back 3 years, and then go forward? Do you know for sure?
Yeah. So when you're a designer and you're going to claim the 179D deduction, you take it in the year that the project was completed, so construction completion. Typically for a designer, you can apply that to any return that's still amendable. So if you guys know anything about your taxes, you can typically amend for 3 years after you filed, and then after that you hit your statute of limitations. So you could go back 3 years and look at projects done in those last 3 years, but you would have to amend your return to claim that. And then anything moving forward, of course, you can do in real time. If you generate more deductions than you're able to claim in a year, you can carry those forward. So you would essentially put yourself in losses and carry those forward. You can't carry them back.
So for the tax year 2024, I could go back 2 more years, 24, 23, and 21.
And 22, 21 right now,
20.
you're probably running into your statute of limitations based on when you filed. So we have some clients who are still looking on their 2021 tax year, but it time's of the essence at this
But
point.
that hasn't changed.
No, that's been the rules, yeah.
Thank you.
Any more burning questions about incentives? Everyone's going to go file before they all go away. We're all very prepared now. Yeah, go ahead.
Unfortunately, my question is not about incentives,
That's
but
okay, we
more
can
about
pivot.
how do I present. So I'm a product manager. I'm bringing decarbonization, ESG scores, all this important things to my customers, to my upper management. And because we're a $2 billion company, but I only look at about $40 million worth of business, how do I prioritize this conversation with, the board members to look at my portion of the business, because they get overwhelmed, right? If they think they have to do thousands of products, where I just want them,
I can start maybe. I would say your 2 best friends within your company are going to be your sales team and your legal team. And that sounds like a really weird partnership and maybe 2 contrasting personalities, if you know those personalities. I would say work with your sales team to try and find those customers who care about this. What is the business you might not win, or that you actually risk losing if you do not do this? And that was a big thing for us, is we had large enterprise customers who were saying to us, if you do not do this, you will no longer be a supplier. So get those sales voices in the room. Money talks, that's the biggest thing. And then on the other side of that spectrum, you have your legal team. And if there are regulatory changes, that's the other thing that makes a company, especially a multi-billion-dollar company, your legal team will be the one who will also help say, these regulations are changing. If we do not comply to this, or we do not adjust to this, there is a business risk. So I would say the carrot and the stick, have your sales, have your legal team, and make them your best friends.
Yeah.
Just want to echo that. It definitely, because you do get the pressure from both ends. You get the pressure, hey, we as a business need to be compliant with EPDs. We're seeing it happen. And we're very diverse in our product management as well. So how do you convince product managers other than that $40 million product line to get on board as well? And that does come from the customer demands and the customer requests. And certainly something, from a European standpoint, we talked about kind of the business incentives on the North American side and the regulatory incentives on the Europe side. They really go hand in hand and start playing off each other. The fact that you're doing the EPD work for Europe means that you can apply that same notion in North America and even Asia, where it's less critical, but you're benefiting. If you have a global product line, you're benefiting your global platform. So we see all these benefits and all these things kind of playing together, and it's really a mission of the company to be aggressive in compliance with sustainability types of regulations.
Sorry, just one more thing. How easy is it to subcategorize those scores, though? Is it for the entire company, or can you do it, say, like individual facilities within the parent company?
So it's going to depend what kind of scoring you're looking at. If it's things like certification like ISO 14001, which is based on energy management systems, that is based on your location. So for us, for example, we have certification at our France facility, and it's coming to our Canadian facility. For scores, like for us, the big one that I was talking about where certain companies are cutting those low performers, it's EcoVadis. That one, again, is for our European operations, but it is a registered company. So it might depend as well where you're registered, but I would say it would be case by case depending on what kind of scoring you're looking at. For the most part, we do try and roll all the way up to Acuity Brands. That is kind of the safe space, because that tends to be where we are vetted by third parties like SBTI and others and audited. So I would say it's really going to be case dependent, which I know is not probably everyone's favorite answer.
I was going to ask, and it kind of builds on what you were saying earlier, Lauren, with the sort of getting the corporate carbon emissions footprint. Like, one, how big a lift is that exercise to just for the company, not for a product? And then, maybe for Bill and Scott, you were saying that the controls are already in place. We can start tracking that information today. How big a lift is it to start measuring those kind of scope 1 and scope 2 categories?
Well, I could start there. For I'm not going to lie, it's a bigger lift the first year. It is a great opportunity to lean into summer interns. If you do have that as an opportunity, it is a lot of manual chasing down, adding to an Excel spreadsheet kind of work. So definitely summer interns can be great. There are different programs that are starting to be created at the university level that is specific to sustainability. So you can get some great talent coming straight out of university for that. It is a bigger lift that first year. Right now, for the most part, companies in the U.S. are looking at Scope 1 and 2. California did have their regulation, their state bill that was passed this past year, SB 253, if I'm not mistaken, that does require Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reporting. And so if you are selling into California, businesses in California, I would strongly encourage you to think about it. And they are now looking to extend that state bill to also be if you're a supplier to the California government. So that is an opportunity. I don't know if anyone is working with the California government, but that is something that they're looking at as well, that's a very minimum thing that you need to have, the Scope 1, 2, and 3. So I think cheap labor, lovely cheap labor with our interns, but that could be a great opportunity. And it's probably the right time, actually, to start looking at that with your teams for this coming summer, if that's something that you want to do.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's critical in the supply chain that much like our customers are looking to us, we look to our suppliers. So Johnson Controls buys about $15 billion worth of materials every year. So we go all the way down in those procurement agreements. We force our suppliers to provide the information so that it can cascade down the supply chain. So that's critically important. If you don't have visibility to that, you can't possibly report.
What about the controls? How do you put, sensors, controls, sub-meters in place to kind of track that carbon?
Yeah, what's happened with the devices today that are available is, again, the cost is lower than ever to get data out of the building. And as I mentioned earlier, integration is a great thing, which is tying in existing equipment so you can get the data and get command and control of it. And then there's all sorts of cool new sensors that are on common, I'll say, network type devices. So we don't have to string a wire, say, across this whole building to pick up that sensor anymore. We have so many options to do it. It's such a lower cost. So really, but in for the end users, it's hard to get them to accept the new technology, if you may, for different reasons. And so there is that, that like what we can do and what we end up doing. There's still that, it's not as easy as it seems. Even though the technology supports it, we're still a little ways from making it mainstream.
I mean, from a sensification, the integration and the ease of getting the data out in a digitized building, in a smart building, there is a sub-trend of sensor fatigue because there's so much data and the software is still on that mission to get better and better, incrementally better over time. So you kind of go back and forth. If you end up in a situation where I've got too much information, I can't make sense of it. So there is, something that we're seeing is this. Oh, I did all this. The information was worthless. I have to upgrade the system already, and I only got 2 years out of it, and I didn't see the benefits. So that's something to be careful of, for sure.
Can I just plug one more thing? Later today. We're showing AI tools that are saving tons of energy. So AI is going to become a factor in this. And we talked about the ease of getting the data now from the building. And while there is sensor fatigue, there's also the opposite, which is, we're not getting enough data. Your sampling rates are too far apart, things like that. So we're seeing increase in the amount of data that we can give an AI engine, maybe on a cloud, which is really going to hyper accelerate finding energy savings for the end users here. And that part of the industry is exploding right now, folks. I can't count how many software vendors are showing me different platforms that'll do this. It started with the analytic conversation, but with AI now, it's rapidly intensified. So a lot of interesting software coming up, I think. So.
Very disruptive. Yep.
Yeah, we have an AI presentation. The times are on the wall outside as you leave, so you can take a look at that. Oh,
it's the next one?
So just stick around.
Don't move. Don't move. The topic keeps going.
Okay, y'all, 1 minute.
So just a quick question. It sounds like there are, between EPDs and all the different tax incentives and credits, is there a way to learn enough about this to do it ourselves, or do we really need a consultant to take full advantage of all of this? And if there is a way to at least get partway there, where do we start with our learning?
Yeah, and as far as the incentives go, I recommend having a consultant that you work with because we have to talk about somebody's tax position, right? And that's way out of your wheelhouse, I would assume. But a great place to start, right? Getting educated, at least understanding the basics so you can say, hey, I think we've got maybe an opportunity here. Let me connect you with a consultant we trust. Is you can go to the USGBC, has great webinars. Department of Energy has great webinars, a lot of resources online. And then I recommend, honestly, following folks on LinkedIn who are plugged into the space. The law is always changing. There's always guidance coming out that helps us to understand how they want us to implement these programs. Plus, we have the chance that legislation could come through and change some of these. So following someone who's plugged in and who is posting about this is just helpful for you to understand. And again, have a trusted resource where you can know enough to identify the opportunities. And then if you have a building owner or opportunity, then you can then use those consultants to hopefully get them across the finish line. Yeah, absolutely. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I post a lot to try to just share basic information again, because I think education is key and it comes from you guys because you're the folks talking to the folks implementing these projects.
Thanks, Abby. I love how this pivoted just based on people's concerns and interests right now. So thank you so much for being here. Yeah. Okay, we are out of time. You have half an hour to go get coffee, and then you can all come back for the AI one.
Hold on while we pay.
Thank you.
Excellent, Scott.
Thank you.